He went hiking alone to clear his mind, but instead, he uncovered a helicopter wreck that had been hidden for decades, and the terrifying secret inside it was never meant to be found. Watch till the end. Like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. The first light of dawn stretched thin across the peaks, turning the frost on the rocks into fields of silver. Jordan adjusted the straps of his pack and inhaled sharply. The air was cold enough to sting his lungs, and it reminded him why he was there, to feel something real again. For months, his life had been an endless circuit of screens, deadlines, and meaningless chatter that echoed through city walls. Now all that noise had been stripped away, leaving only him, the mountain, and the steady rhythm of his breath. He had spent weeks preparing for this climb. Every item in his backpack had a purpose. Rope coiled with military precision, climbing spikes polished and tested, tent rolled tight enough to fit like a puzzle into the pack. In the side pocket, tucked neatly between a thermos and a compass, was his small black notebook. Pages filled with half-finished thoughts and fragments of questions he could never answer among people. Here, in the solitude of the mountains, he hoped the silence might finally give him one. The path wound upward through a dense forest of pine and spruce. Frost clung to the needles, turning the trees into sculptures of ice. Each step Jordan took crunched faintly on the frozen earth, the sound oddly loud in the stillness. Birds stirred high in the branches but did not sing. Even nature seemed to be holding its breath. He stopped once to look back. The valley below already swallowed by shadow. The world he had left behind reduced to a smear of blue and gray. By midday the trees began to thin. The slope grew steeper, and the soil gave way to slabs of rock that glittered with veins of ice. He moved slowly, carefully testing each step. One mistake here could end everything. But there was a strange comfort in that knowledge. No lies in the mountain's rules, no pretense, no mercy, no second chances, only the truth of endurance. He paused on a narrow ridge, took a sip from his canteen, and wiped the frost from his beard. The wind shifted, howling through the peaks with a sound that reminded him of a scream carried across a great distance. The cold bit into his cheeks. He pulled up the zipper of his jacket and moved on. By the time the sun began to sink, Jordan's legs burned with exhaustion. He found a small ledge sheltered by stone and set up his tent. His hands were stiff with cold, but his motions were practiced and sure. When the tent stood firm against the wind, he crawled inside, lit his small stove, and boiled water for a meal. The hiss of the flame filled the silence. Outside, the world darkened into an ocean of shadows. He ate slowly, watching steam curl from his cup, then pulled out his notebook. The pages trembled slightly in his hands. He wrote a few words. Quiet. Truth. Wait. And stopped. He couldn't explain the rest. He wasn't even sure what he was looking for anymore. Peace, maybe. Or just proof that he still existed beneath all the layers of noise life had wrapped him in. Later he unzipped the tent and stepped out into the night. The cold hit him instantly, biting deep through his clothes. Above him the sky blazed with stars. Sharp, endless, impossibly close. The Milky Way cut across the darkness like a scar of light. He felt very small then, smaller than he'd ever felt before. Yet the feeling wasn't despair. It was clarity, a humbling reminder that the world did not need him to keep turning. The wind moved between the cliffs, whispering through the stones. For a moment, he thought he heard something else in it, faint, distant, almost like a voice carried from far away. He turned his head, scanning the ridge above. Nothing but the white curve of rock and the shifting light of stars. He told himself it was just the wind. Mountains had a way of playing tricks on those who listened too closely. Back inside the tent, the fabric rustled restlessly as the gusts picked up. Sleep came slow, shallow, filled with half-dreams of collapsing stone and moving shadows. Once or twice, he thought he felt the ground tremble faintly beneath him, as if something vast shifted deep within the mountain itself. When dawn finally came, Jordan awoke with the uneasy sense that the mountain was watching him, not with malice, but with intent. He broke camp, packed his gear, and resumed the climb. The air grew thinner, sharper, every breath a test of will. He welcomed the pain. It meant he was still alive. By midday, the sun climbed high, but its warmth never reached him. He stopped near a wall of stone streaked with ice to rest. As he raised his head to check the ridge ahead, something caught his eye. A faint flash of light, brief as a blink, from far above. At first he thought it was just a patch of melting frost catching the sun, but then it flickered again. Bright, metallic, deliberate. Jordan frowned. There shouldn't have been anything reflective that high up. No trails, no climbers, no metal. The mountain was supposed to be empty. The rational part of his mind said to ignore it. It was probably nothing. But another voice, the quiet one that had brought him here in the first place, whispered otherwise. He adjusted his pack, gripped the rocks, and began to climb toward the glint. The wind strengthened as he ascended. Pebbles skittered underfoot, tumbling into the abyss below. His breath came harsh and loud, each exhale a cloud of frost. The higher he went, the stronger the reflection became. No longer a fleeting spark, but a steady metallic gleam peeking from behind a ledge. By the time he reached it, the sun was beginning to fade behind a veil of clouds. Jordan pulled himself up over the ridge and froze. Just ahead, wedged between two massive walls of granite, lay the twisted remains of a helicopter. Its blades were bent like broken wings, its cabin shattered. Frost clung to the glass, cracked and pale as old bone. The tail had snapped clean off and embedded itself into the rock a few feet away. The metal was corroded, streaked with age. Whatever had brought it here hadn't happened recently. Jordan's breath caught. For a long moment, he didn't move. The wind hissed through the wreck's jagged frame, making a low, moaning sound that didn't seem entirely natural. He had come to the mountains searching for solitude. Instead, he had found a ghost. The wreck waited in a pocket of windless air, a dark shape pressed into the rock as if the mountain had tried to swallow it and failed. Jordan stood a few steps away, the world muffled by altitude and frost, watching the fractured cockpit glass glow faintly under the veiled sun. The rotors were splayed and twisted, one blade pinned under a ledge, another angled like a bent spear toward the sky. No paint scheme survived intact. Only pale stripes on the tail boom and a ghost of a logo that meant nothing now. He swallowed, tasting the dry bite of cold, and moved closer. The skin of the fuselage was scarred with long, jagged tears where metal had given way. The side door, once a slick, gas-springed panel, hung crooked from one hinge. Somebody had forced it open long ago, or the impact had torn it that way. Either way, the opening was just wide enough for a careful body to slip through. He hesitated with one hand on the lip. Every part of him wanted to know what waited inside. A smaller, quieter part told him to leave this tomb shut. He listened. Nothing. No creak of settling metal. No dislodged stones. Only the thin hiss of air sneaking around torn edges. He took a breath, angled his headlamp, and climbed in. Cold breathed out of the cabin like something alive. The beam of light cut through a fine mist of dust and ice crystals, turning the air into glittering static. For a moment he could see nothing beyond the cone of white and a scatter of ruined surfaces. Then shapes resolved. Leather club chairs, a low credenza, the curved wall of a wet bar without its bottles. The wealth here had not been modest. Even wrecked, it announced itself in the padded armrests, the polished veneer cracked in spider webs, the custom overhead panel now blackened in places with soot. He expected carnage. He didn't know why. Only that every story he'd absorbed about crashes trained the mind to look for it. Instead, the scene was defined by absence. No bodies, no bones, no dangling straps cradling what was once a human form. He swept the light slowly. A blanket lay half-folded on the floor near the bar. An oxygen mask dangled uselessly from a panel. Someone's scarf was caught on a hinge by a few threads, the silk brittle and bleached. A tray table had been pulled down and left askew, its latch warped by heat. There, a ring of smoke stains overhead where plastic had puckered and grayed. Not a raging fire, There wasn't fuel for that up here, but a small, stubborn flame built from whatever they could feed it. He knelt without thinking and pressed his glove into a faint smear of ash near the aisle, rubbing it between his fingers. Old. He traced the way the soot had traveled, streaks up the side of a cabinet where warm air had drawn it, the smudged heel prints near the galley bulkhead where someone had stood again and again warming hands or guarding sparks. He tried to picture it. The first stunned hours after impact, the shock clearing, the inventory of what was left, bodies groaning or quiet, someone deciding to tear up seat cushions, someone else digging through the galley looking for tins and packets, the air growing thin and merciless as the light died outside, a flare used and useless now, the decision to make heat, even if only enough to keep fingers from going numb. He stood, turned, and saw them, marks carved low into the smooth plastic of the bulkhead, where a person huddled would have been able to reach without standing. 4 vertical scores, then a diagonal lash crossing them, one group, then another, staggered and uneven, 100 tiny failures of neatness that made them look more human. He touched the highest bundle. The grooves were shallow but certain, a rhythm of survival measured in days. Someone lived, he said aloud before he realized he'd spoken. His voice sounded wrong in the cabin, like a broadcast to an empty room. He moved forward. The luxury of the cabin gathered in sad little clusters. At one chair, the armrest compartment was open and empty, its felt lining rubbed shiny by cold hands. On the carpet he found a tin can with a lid pierced raggedly by something sharp. Inside, only a dusting of crystals remained, the taste of metal and long vanished salt rising in his nose. He found a shattered crystal glass cradled safely in a shoe, as if a stranger had once believed it would matter again. A leather carry-on unzipped, spilled silk ties, and a notebook with its first pages torn out. He found a wallet wedged under a seat, photographs sealed together by damp and time. He didn't pry. The faces needed no names to accuse him of looking. He kept searching. The cabin narrowed toward the front, where the rich finishes gave way to utilitarian panels. The cockpit door had been forced inward from the cabin side, one hinge wrenched loose, the other holding by a bent pin. He shouldered it aside and stepped into the cramped triangle where the helicopter's life had paused. Glass everywhere, crazed and frozen in place. Overhead, the top panels sagged where the structure had flexed. The cyclic and collective were jammed forward at odd angles, and the foot pedals told their own story. One set blown backward from its mount, metal folded like cardboard, the other jammed to one side. The instrument cluster was a graveyard. Altimeter needles that meant nothing now, engine gauges dark, warning lights locked in the last moment of power with lipstick smears of frost. On the floor lay a mess of paper. Jordan squatted carefully, boots set wide to avoid shifting anything. He picked up the largest fragment first, a weather bulletin, the kind a crew might scribble on and keep within reach. The type was faded but legible, crosswinds, icing potential, a band of turbulence like teeth on a map. He replaced it and lifted another scrap, a torn page with a few surviving lines of hurried handwriting that looked like cockpit print, each letter cut with sharp practice strokes. Course deviation due to conditions, and below it, misaligned as if added before a door swung or a hand slipped. Cargo control. Keep close. He stayed still after reading, the words warming and cooling in his head. Cargo, not luggage, not personal effects. Cargo that required control, proximity, importance. He looked again at the cockpit, at the empty seats. Emergency kit slots were open. The crash axe was gone from its clip. The first aid box lid hung empty. Someone, or more than one someone, had had time to unclip, to choose. He slid the scraps back exactly where they'd been and rose to scan the side panels. In the web of wiring behind a broken display, a corner of a laminated card stuck out. He drew it free, a checklist browned at the edges, the emergency section marked by a folded corner. Auto rotation, fuel isolation, ELT. Activate. He glanced around for the beacon unit and found its cavity open, wires clipped cleanly. They had either removed the transmitter, hoping to save battery, or to bring it out where signal could escape, or someone had taken it afterward. Either way, He felt the weight of those invisible decisions press against his ribs. He backed out into the cabin, conscious of his footprints overlaying the scuffs of strangers. Near the floor by the doorframe, his lamp picked out something small. He crouched and lifted a silver lighter, tarnished, heavy in the palm, the cap still hinged and satisfying beneath his thumb. He flicked, more out of reflex than hope. Nothing but the dry click, click, click of a flint that had given up a lifetime ago. He set it back exactly where it had been. In the small lounge section behind the main seating, a curtain hung from a bent track, dividing nothing from nothing. He pushed it aside and found a space once meant for privacy, 2 facing chairs, a low table bolted to the deck, a cabinet with its door sprung. The cabinet had held crystal. Tiny prisms of it still glittered in the carpet like frost. On the table sat a narrow metal case with a crushed corner. Its latch was intact but strained. He ran his fingers along its seam and then pulled his hand away. Not yet. Not here. He didn't want the mountain to decide where or if the contents belonged to him. He kept sweeping. The cabin's rear quarter was uglier, structure exposed, soundproofing torn and drooping, insulation foam turned to crust. Here, personal debris had snowed down and settled in the angles. A broken sunglasses arm, a snapped heel, a single cufflink shaped like a small gold knot. He picked it up, turned it in the light, imagined it clinging to a shirt in a warm room far from this cliff. He put it back where it had been caught, as if even now it marked a seat where someone used to sit. The silence grew heavier the longer he stayed. It wasn't only the lack of voices, it was the pressure of all the near voices, the ones that had once filled this space with small, ordinary sounds. The tap of a ring on glass, a zipper, a nervous laugh, the dry flip of paper. He felt an ache behind his eyes and pressed a knuckle there, angry at himself for granting strangers the dignity of grief when they were already long past needing it. He forced himself into a slower, more methodical circuit, counting seats, noting how many belts were buckled and how many lay loose. He found the galley proper and its little triumphs of desperation, cans levered open by the crash axe's edge, sachets of sugar torn and emptied, a plastic bag tied with a knot around a collection of odds and ends that might have been organized as rations. A single tea bag had been taped to the inside of a cabinet door at eye level, as if someone had wanted to save it, to keep hope sealed behind a childish barrier. The tally marks near the bulkhead drew him back and held him. He followed them to their end. A group stopped mid-count, not a neat 5, not even 4. 3 lines, the third shallower than the first 2. And then nothing. His skin prickled. The story refused to finish itself, as if the hand that carved those lines had been pulled away, called, interrupted by rescue or doom or something between. He eased himself down onto the edge of a seat cushion and sat with his hands clasped hard between his knees. The helicopter creaked once, a sound like an old ship. Outside, wind probed the torn door, changed its mind, and moved on. Time had been busy here, rearranging and erasing. Yet for all its effort, it had failed to provide the one mercy it gave most places of death: closure. The cabin insisted on the opposite. It turned absence into presence until he felt surrounded by what he could not see. He stood because sitting felt like permission to be haunted. Before slipping out, he made himself do one more slow pass, this time with his headlamp off, letting only the weak daylight reach into the wreck. Without the hard white cone, the space became less a crime scene and more a cave. He caught shapes that the lamp had overwhelmed, oils on leather darkened in fingerprints, a smudge at shoulder height near the door where someone had braced and pushed, the faint skitter marks in grit where a heavy object had been dragged across the aisle. He followed those shallow tracks to the threshold and into the light. Outside, the wind returned, restless and persuasive. He circled the fuselage, boots gritty on the stone. The helicopter had gouged its way into a shallow trench during the crash, and old meltwater had hardened the disturbed gravel into a kind of plaster that recorded what had happened afterward. He found, not far from the torn door, a run of parallel grooves no wider than his thumb, long and almost perfectly straight for 3 meters before the geology broke them. He crouched over them and pressed a fingertip into the cold, brittle surface. The grooves broke into flakes under the smallest pressure. Old then. Very old. But unambiguous. Something narrow and heavy had been laid on the ground and pulled away. A crate, a case, a stretcher. Anything with skids or edges that could cut those lines. He scrubbed the pad of his finger against his palm as if he could erase the confirmation. The light had thinned to a pewter wash. He checked the sky automatically, reading the clouds the way a half-taught student reads a language, catching meaning by pieces. High streamers pointing to wind aloft, the fast knitting of lower layers. The mountain would not offer him a long afternoon. He turned back to the wreck one last time, leaned in and inhaled the smell of it. Cold metal, soaked foam, the ghost of smoke, trying to brand it on his memory in case weather sealed this place again. On the way to his tent, he felt the first flakes of a new storm sting his cheeks, dry and small and mean. He took the long line down to the sheltered ledge and set the tent in muscle memory, anchoring it with rocks more than stakes. He lit the stove and held his hands over its small fan of heat until the ache left his knuckles. Then he pulled the black notebook from his pocket, opened it to a blank page, and wrote in a tight, steady script as if it were not his hand. Wreck located at approximate elevation. Civilian executive model. No remains visible. Evidence of post-crash survival. Soot. Opened rations. Tally marks. Cockpit fragment. Course deviation due to conditions. Cargo control. Keep close. He paused, listening to the tent fabric crackle. Then almost reluctantly, drag marks outside. Direction. Down gorge. He put the notebook away and ate without tasting, counting spoonfuls instead of flavor. When the wind came in earnest, it pressed the tent wall against his shoulder in steady pulses. He lay on his back with his hands folded over his chest and let the storm climb over him. From somewhere above the ledge, through rock and wreckage, he thought he could hear a tone in the wind that didn't belong, thin, thread-like, like wires humming. He told himself it was the rotor blades shifting barely as gusts tested them. He told himself 1,000 sensible things and believed none of them completely. Sleep came late and broke early. When he crawled back out into the open, dawn had reduced the world to 2 colors, a hard gray sky and a crusted white slope. The air had that blunted quiet that follows the night's hard work. He stood for a long time, following with his eyes the line of the gorge, the way it dove away from view, the way the light pooled in it like something held. He didn't go back to the wreck yet. He didn't need to. The shape of what he would find next had already begun to form, a shape built from tally marks, soot, a missing beacon, and a pair of words that would not stop echoing in the hollows of his skull. Cargo control. Keep close. He couldn't decide which part of the sentence bothered him more. The arrogance of control in a place that erased control in an instant, or the suggestion of proximity, as if the cargo had a gravity of its own and the living had orbited it to the last. He drew his gloves tight and looked up at the scarp where the helicopter lay hidden from the world's simple lines of sight. The mountain had not given him answers. It had given him a promise of deeper questions. He felt both lighter and heavier as he shouldered his pack. Lighter because the climb had purpose now beyond the personal. Heavier because purpose makes a person visible, even to things that do not use eyes. He started toward the wreck again, the snow squeaking under his boots, breath making ghosts in the air. He didn't yet know about the case he had left on the lounge table, or the sealed envelope waiting inside it, or the way a single wax seal can turn a mystery into a threat. He only knew that he could not leave a place that had begun to speak, not until he could tell whether the marks cut into plastic ended in salvation or in silence. And as he climbed, the mountain exhaled and filled the gorge with a breeze that slid past him and up into the pocket where the helicopter dreamed, carrying with it the dry, almost voice of something heavy once dragged into the white and lost. The morning arrived sharp and white, the mountain washed clean by the night's wind. Jordan stood before the wreck again, its hull half buried under a dusting of fresh snow. The silence was unbearable, too complete, too absolute. It pressed against his ears until even his own heartbeat sounded foreign. He adjusted the strap of his pack and stepped inside the torn cabin, boots crunching softly over frozen debris. The cold inside was worse than outside, thick and heavy like a weight on his chest. His flashlight beam sliced through the gloom, glinting off bits of glass and aluminum. He moved with care, past the rows of ruined seats and the blackened mark on the floor where a fire had once burned. He crouched near the galley, his gloved fingers brushing over the same soot he had seen yesterday. The stain told a story of survival, short, desperate, and unfinished. He began searching deeper, into corners he had not yet explored. A shattered storage locker revealed only empty tins and the brittle skeletons of wrappers. Someone had eaten here, lived here, and waited for something that never came. The air smelled faintly of rust and time, and under it, something sour, like old smoke trapped for decades. His light caught the same scrawled marks on the wall, tallies grouped unevenly, ending mid-count. He felt again that quiet ache, that sense of a life cut off in motion. He pressed on, pushing through the wreckage until he reached the small lounge at the back. There, on the bent table, the crushed metal case still waited. Yesterday he had left it untouched. Now, curiosity won. He slipped his knife beneath the latch and pried gently until the warped metal creaked and split open. Inside lay folders, sealed with faded ribbons, and a single envelope marked with a cracked wax seal. He hesitated, his breath clouding in the cold, then took them out carefully. The documents were brittle but still legible. Contracts, names, long numbers, dates decades old. His eyes caught words like transfer, asset, and confidential. Beneath the formal language, a pattern took shape. Transactions hidden behind layers of shell companies, agreements written in code. The handwriting on the margins was different from the typed lines, hurried, almost frantic. One note in particular made him pause. Zurich finalization. Ensure discretion until delivery. Delivery, he whispered. His mind jumped back to the scrawled words in the cockpit. Cargo control. Keep close. This wasn't just a flight gone wrong. Whatever they had carried, it was worth more than lives. And somewhere, it had been meant to arrive. He slid the papers back and tucked the sealed envelope into his jacket pocket. The wax was brittle, but he didn't dare open it yet. The wind outside shifted, brushing faintly through the broken fuselage, and for an instant, he imagined it sighing words he couldn't understand. When he turned toward the exit, his boot caught on something small and metallic. He bent down and lifted it. A wristwatch. Face cracked. Hands frozen forever at 3:30. A thin strap of worn leather dangled from its edge. He stared at it, thinking of the owner, someone who had sat here counting minutes before the crash stole them away. He set it gently back on the seat where he'd found it and climbed out. Outside, the world had changed again. The wind had swept the snow into ripples, but near the helicopter's shadow, something different caught his eye. Lines in the hardened gravel beneath the snow, faint, but deliberate. He crouched, brushing away the frost. Two long grooves stretched away from the wreck, vanishing into the narrow gorge below. They weren't random scratches, they were drag marks. Heavy objects had been hauled away inch by inch. He followed the grooves a few meters until the slope grew too steep. The marks continued downward, lost among the boulders. His heart thudded faster. Survivors had been here. They hadn't waited for rescue. They had taken something with them and left. But where? And why had no one ever found them? The wind picked up, sharp as glass. He glanced at the sky. Clouds were gathering fast over the peaks, curling like dark smoke. The air thickened with a hush that meant only one thing, a storm. The mountain was closing in. He turned back, but the first gust struck before he could reach the wreck. Snow began to fall in furious sheets, driving against his hood and stinging his face. Visibility dropped to nothing. He stumbled the last few meters and clambered into the helicopter's open door just as the storm roared to life. Inside, the wind screamed through the cracks in the fuselage. a chorus of howls that rose and fell like voices. The temperature plummeted. He dropped to his knees, pressing himself against the cold metal, listening. Through the roar of the storm came a new sound, faint but distinct. Footsteps. Slow, uneven. Inside the wreck, he froze, heart hammering, eyes darting toward the dark aisle. His flashlight beam trembled as he swung it. Nothing. Only empty seats, shards of glass, and the rippling curtain that hung at the back. It moved slightly, though there was no draft. He swallowed hard and took a step closer. "Hello?" His own voice sounded alien, swallowed by the noise. The curtain shifted again, slowly this time, as if touched by an unseen hand. He lunged forward and yanked it aside, empty space. Nothing but the broken table, the cracked cabinet, and the pale flicker of snowlight seeping through a tear in the metal. Yet the air felt wrong, disturbed, as though someone had been there moments ago. He backed away, his breath coming fast. The storm battered the wreck for hours. He huddled against the wall, the beam of his light fixed on the doorway, unwilling to let darkness claim it. The wind's voice changed as the night deepened, sometimes a moan, sometimes a whistle, sometimes something that sounded dangerously like words. He clenched his jaw and told himself it was the air moving through the rotors. But each time the sound rose, his stomach turned with cold dread. At last the flashlight flickered and died, leaving him in gray half-light from the snow beyond the broken windows. He sat there until the wind began to fade, until silence crept back with heavy steps. When he finally forced himself outside, dawn was breaking, a dull, colorless glow, spreading across the peaks. The world looked new and untouched. The wreck was half buried, its tail lost beneath a mound of snow. The drag marks were gone, erased. He stood staring at the blank white slope where yesterday's evidence had been. The mountain had covered its tracks. Whatever truth it had shown him, it had now hidden again. But he couldn't unsee it. The grooves, the words in the log, the case, the envelope. The survivors had left with something, and the mountain had buried what they left behind. Jordan turned toward his tent far below, the wind already picking up again. He was shivering now, not from the cold but from a growing certainty. The wreck wasn't just a monument to disaster. It was a doorway, and he had only stepped through the first room. Somewhere in the vast silence beyond, the rest of the story waited. He slung his pack over his shoulder and began the careful descent back toward his camp. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper, following him down the slope. And for the first time since he'd arrived, he wondered if the mountain wanted him to find the truth, or to become part of it. The morning came like an afterthought, weak light seeping through a bruised sky, touching the mountain with a colorless hand. Jordan hadn't slept. The storm had passed hours ago, but the memory of those phantom steps still echoed in his mind. Every gust of wind outside the tent had sounded like movement. Every crack of ice had whispered his name. When he finally crawled out into the thin air, the world felt hollow, stripped of sound. Even the birds were gone. He climbed back toward the wreck, driven not by curiosity now, but by something darker, an obsession to know. The snow had settled deep overnight, smoothing every edge and burying every clue. When he reached the helicopter, only half the fuselage was visible. He brushed snow from the side door and ducked inside, his breath forming clouds that hung in the stillness. The cabin had changed, not in shape, but in feeling. The silence was thicker now, more watchful. The soot marks on the walls seemed darker, and the scratches, the tally marks, looked fresh. His mind told him that was impossible, but the thought still rooted deep and refused to leave. He steadied his hands and switched on his flashlight. The documents from the metal case lay where he'd left them, slightly dusted with snow. The sealed envelope in his jacket pocket felt heavier than before, as though it had grown in weight overnight. He sat down on the frozen floor, pulled it out and stared at the cracked wax seal. It bore no insignia, only a crude impression of a circle, like someone had pressed a ring or coin into soft wax long ago. The edges were chipped. He hesitated for a moment, then broke the seal. Inside were several sheets of thick paper folded together, their edges yellowed and brittle. The ink had bled in places, but the handwriting remained legible. Controlled, deliberate, the kind that came from someone used to signing orders that couldn't be questioned. He began to read. At first the words meant little. Lists of numbers, coordinates, coded phrases like unit secured and asset transfer complete. But as the sentences unfolded, they began to shape a story, one of movement, secrecy, and immense risk. The helicopter hadn't been on a routine flight. It had been carrying people in something they called the cargo. No details, no descriptions, only that it required constant supervision and was never to be left unattended. Further down the page, he found a note scribbled in haste. Contact lost after second approach. Crew instructed to divert. Last known position classified under Project Halcyon. He frowned. The name meant nothing to him, yet it pulsed with menace, like a secret that shouldn't have survived. He read on. The second page was different, less formal, almost a confession. It spoke of betrayal and fear. One of the passengers suspected that someone on board wasn't meant to be there, that they had boarded last minute carrying their own sealed case, that the storm wasn't natural, it had been expected, a diversion, perhaps, a way to disappear from radar. Jordan's hands trembled as he turned the final page. It wasn't a report at all. It was a letter addressed to someone unnamed. If you find this, you will know we were not lost by accident. We carried proof of everything. They will come for it, even now. Hide it. Don't trust the signal. The mountain is safer than the world below. The words ended abruptly, as though the writer had been interrupted mid-sentence. He sat frozen for a long time, staring at the letter. The air in the cabin felt alive, shifting around him. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Proof of everything, he whispered. What had these people discovered? What had they tried to hide here, so far from anyone who could find it? He looked again at the case. He had gone through the folders too quickly the first time. Now he spread them out, brushing away the frost. Beneath the layers of contracts and coded messages, he found photographs, black and white, grainy, stamped with red ink. Some showed men in suits shaking hands near military aircraft. Others depicted vast storage containers being loaded into trucks under night skies. The last photo made his stomach tighten. It showed the same helicopter he sat in now, gleaming and new, parked on an airfield under floodlights. Behind it stood a group of 5 people, 2 pilots, 2 men in suits, and a woman wearing dark glasses even though it was night. Their faces were sharp and proud, their postures rigid. On the back of the photograph, written in the same careful handwriting, were the words, Halcyon, Final Transport. He lowered the photo, his breath fogging the air. His pulse quickened as a terrible realization began to take shape. The letter had warned that they will come for it. If that was true, then perhaps they already had. Maybe the survivors hadn't simply vanished. Maybe they'd been found and silenced. He stood and scanned the cabin again, his light darting over every surface. There were no signs of struggle, but there didn't need to be. The drag marks outside told their own story. Something, or someone, had been removed from here deliberately. The thought made his throat dry. He rubbed his fingers together, feeling the grit of soot and dust grind into his skin. A low rumble rolled across the mountain, distant but unmistakable. Thunder, or something heavier. He stepped to the broken window and peered outside. Snow drifted lazily through the air, yet somewhere beyond the ridge, he saw movement. Brief, almost imagined. A shadow slipping between boulders. Then another. He blinked hard, but the slope was empty again. The wind picked up, howling down the gorge. He backed away from the opening, every nerve alert. He told himself it was the weather, a trick of light, fatigue. But deep down, he felt watched. Whoever had written that letter hadn't just been paranoid. They had known someone would follow. He packed the documents, the photos, the letter, all of it, into his pack. He would bring them down the mountain. He needed proof, Something tangible. The world had to see what lay buried up here. Outside, the daylight was already fading, though it was barely noon. The storm clouds had returned, heavier than before. As he began the descent, the snow thickened, turning the air into a curtain of white. The helicopter disappeared behind him, swallowed by the storm. He pushed on, each step a fight against gravity and cold. The mountain seemed alive now, murmuring beneath the wind. Rocks shifted underfoot. The echo of his footsteps distorted until they sounded doubled, as if someone else was walking behind him. He glanced over his shoulder more than once, but the trail was empty. The storm howled louder, drowning his thoughts. Still he pressed forward, clutching his pack tight against his chest. By the time he reached his tent, darkness had fallen completely. He crawled inside and zipped it shut, the fabric snapping against the wind. His hands shook as he lit the small stove and watched the flame flicker weakly to life. Then, slowly, he unzipped the pack and took out the letter again. He read it once more by firelight. The words seemed to shift, to breathe. Hide it. Don't trust the signal. The mountain is safer than the world below. He glanced at his satellite communicator lying beside him. The thought of turning it on sent a chill up his spine. What if they could trace it? What if that was how the last crew had been found? He snapped it shut and killed the flame. The tent fell into darkness. The mountain outside moaned under the wind, and somewhere in that endless black, a single echo rose and died. A sound that might have been a voice. Or maybe just the mountain remembering. Jordan lay still, gripping the letter against his chest. The mountain, it seemed, wasn't done speaking. By dawn, the mountain had transformed again. The storm had scoured away all tracks, leaving behind a smooth expanse of snow that glimmered like glass. The helicopter was gone from sight, buried beneath drifts and shadow, as if the earth itself had swallowed its secret. Jordan stood on the ridge with his pack strapped tight, the envelope and documents pressing against his back like a second spine. He felt the weight of them in more than just his muscles. They were alive now, whispering of things that refused to stay buried. The sky was a pale, bruised blue, and the air burned his lungs with every breath. The descent would be harder than the climb. The mountain had turned hostile overnight. He could feel it in the wind, how it shifted unpredictably, circling him, whispering in hollow tones that seemed to carry words not meant for human ears. Every gust sounded like the echo of a choice made too late. He began the slow journey downward. His boots crunched into the frozen crust, and the sound carried far in the silence. Below, the gorge yawned open like a scar, dark and endless. Somewhere down there, beyond the frozen ridges the drag marks had once led. Now there was nothing. No trace of the crates, no signs of movement, no hope of following whatever path the survivors or their pursuers had taken. It was as if the mountain had cleaned the slate and rewritten its own story. Jordan's breath came ragged, visible as plumes of mist. The air smelled faintly of ozone, and the static hum of the wind against his jacket made him feel as though unseen eyes were fixed on his back. Each time he stopped to rest, he imagined faint crunches in the snow behind him. But when he turned, the slope lay untouched, serene, pretending innocence. By midday, clouds gathered again, dark, heavy, rolling fast. Snow began to fall, thin at first, then thicker, blinding. He found a ledge of rock that jutted outward and crouched beneath it, shielding himself. The world narrowed to the hiss of falling snow and the sound of his own heartbeat. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the letter. Its paper was stiff with cold, but he could still read the words. Hide it. Don't trust the signal. The mountain is safer than the world below. Safer. He thought of that word and almost laughed. Nothing about this place felt safe anymore. Not the mountain, not the silence, not even his own thoughts. Maybe that was what the writer had meant. Not safety from nature, but from people, from those who had wanted this story buried. Maybe the survivors had believed the mountain would keep the truth from ever reaching the world. But now he had taken it. He had broken their promise. He pulled out his small satellite communicator. The green light blinked faintly, a signal. Weak, But enough. His thumb hovered over the power button. If he activated it, the message could go through. He could send coordinates, a warning, something to prove what he'd found. But the words of the letter screamed in his head. Don't trust the signal. What if they were still listening? What if that was how the first team had died? He hesitated. Snow piled up around his boots, creeping higher with every gust. He stared at the communicator for a long moment, then snapped it shut and shoved it back into his pack. His breath fogged the air. The storm howled louder. He needed to move. He pushed on, each step a battle against the slope. The snow was up to his knees now, and the wind tore at him, biting through layers of fabric and willpower. His mind blurred with exhaustion and cold. Once, he thought he saw movement through the white curtain. Figures, black and distant, climbing toward him. He blinked and they vanished. Imagination or warning he couldn't tell, but he felt it then deep in his bones. He was not alone on this mountain. As he descended lower, the wind eased, and for the first time in hours he could hear something beyond his own breath. A faint rhythmic clicking, metal on stone, deliberate and distant. He turned sharply, scanning the slope above. Nothing. Only snow swirling in mad circles. He listened again. The sound came once more, faint and certain, echoing from somewhere near the gorge. Then silence. He quickened his pace. The gorge loomed ahead. A long wound cut into the mountainside. The air there was still, unnaturally so. No wind, no sound. He stepped onto the ledge that overlooked it and froze. Beneath him, the snow formed strange, unnatural mounds, long, rectangular, half-buried. For a moment, he thought they were rocks. Then he saw the faint outlines of handles, the splintered wood peeking through ice, crates. The same size as the ones that had been dragged from the wreck. He descended carefully, boots slipping on the slope. When he reached the nearest crate, he brushed snow from its lid. The wood was old, split, and scarred by time. Faded black letters ran across it. Property of Halcyon Logistics. Do not open. The lock had rusted into nothing. He wedged his knife under the lid and pried. It opened with a groan that echoed through the gorge. Inside, wrapped in decayed canvas, were stacks of metal cases, smaller, sealed tight. On one, a tag still clung by a thread. The writing had faded, but he could make out 2 words. Biological samples. His stomach turned. What the hell? He whispered. He reached for one case, brushing away the frost. It was heavy, too heavy for its size. Inside, something shifted faintly, a dull slosh. He set it down quickly, pulse hammering in his throat. The letter's warning took on new meaning. The mountain is safer than the world below. Whatever they had been carrying, it wasn't money. It wasn't documents. It was something that was never meant to leave these heights. A sound split the silence, a crunch of snow behind him. He spun around, but the gorge was empty. Still, he felt it again, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. He grabbed his pack and backed away from the open crate. The air grew colder, heavier. The wind, when it came, sounded almost like breathing. He climbed back toward the ledge, stumbling, slipping, his muscles screaming. The mountain seemed to tilt beneath him, as though the ground itself wanted to drag him back. When he finally reached level ground, the sky had turned black with storm clouds. Lightning flashed once, far away, illuminating the slope. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw figures again, 3, maybe 4, standing motionless among the snow, too far to be real. When the light faded, they were gone. He ran. The path blurred beneath him. Snow hammered his back, and the wind howled in rage. He didn't stop until he saw the faint outline of his tent below, half collapsed under the weight of snow. He stumbled inside, gasping for air, tearing off his gloves with shaking hands. He pulled the documents from his pack and spread them out in the dim light of his lantern. They were damp now, edges curling but still legible. He turned to a fresh page in his notebook and began writing. Everything he'd seen, every detail, every mark and word. He wrote as fast as he could, hands numb, letters jagged and uneven. If the mountain swallowed him, Someone had to know. When he finished, he tucked the pages into a plastic sleeve and sealed it inside a waterproof bag. Then he looked once more at the communicator lying beside him. The blinking light was steady now, almost inviting. He hesitated again. The words of the letter echoed one last time. Don't trust the signal. He took a slow breath, then pressed the button. The screen flickered. Static filled the tent. A low hum grew louder, deeper, until it vibrated through his bones. Then faintly a voice broke through the static. "This is base control. Identify yourself." Jordan froze. The voice was wrong, flat, too calm, mechanical. Not the clipped professionalism of a rescue channel, not the warmth of human concern. Something inside him screamed to shut it off, but before he could, the voice spoke again. "Coordinates received. Retrieval in progress." He lunged forward and yanked the battery free. The light died instantly, plunging the tent into darkness. The silence that followed was absolute. Outside, the wind had stopped. He waited, listening. Then, distantly from somewhere above, the low thrum of a rotor. One helicopter, maybe two, growing louder, coming closer. His pulse pounded in his ears. They had come. Not rescue, not help. The ones who had been looking for this since the first crash. He grabbed his notebook and the sealed envelope, zipped them into his coat, and unzipped the back of the tent. The night outside was pitch black, but he ran anyway. Through snow, through shadow, through silence that now felt alive and watching. Behind him, the sound of the rotors deepened, echoing off the cliffs. Beams of light sliced through the storm, sweeping across the slope like the eyes of something hunting. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The mountain had given him its truth, and now it was reclaiming everything else. By the time the searchlights reached his camp, Jordan was gone. The only trace left was a half-buried tent and a torn notebook page fluttering in the wind. On it, written in frozen ink, were the last words he ever wrote. "The mountain remembers, and it keeps its secrets." No one ever saw Jordan again. But the documents he left behind revealed something the world was never meant to know. What would you have done in his place? Subscribe, like, and share this story. And don't forget to comment where you're watching from.